Since its inception in 1890, Nebraska had been working to establish itself in the college football landscape. In its first 51 years as a program, we had racked up 24 conference championships while only sustaining 4 losing seasons. By defeating teams like Notre Dame, Oklahoma, and Minnesota, who at the time was a national powerhouse, they had made themselves known on the national stage. However, as the shadow of a Second World War began to engulf the nation, Nebraska began to face a dark period of its own. Biff Jones's final season in 1941, before being recalled to the war himself, would be the first of 9 straight losing seasons. Over the next 20 seasons, the program would change hands 8 times, have only 2 winning seasons, and average 3.4 wins per season. It would be the worst 20-year stretch in Nebraska football history. In 1962, however, Nebraska would hire a head coach that would alter that course of history forever. Let's get into it. Hi, I'm Aaron Muller, and welcome to Cobsmacked. This is a channel dedicated to Nebraska football, the news, the stories, and the history. If you're a fan of Husker football, be sure to subscribe so you don't miss more videos like this. So in part 1 of this Husker History series, we covered the 19 coaches from the formative years in 1890 to 1941. In part 2 here, we will cover the 8 coaches from 1942 to 1972. A time in which Nebraska would go through its lowest point as a program and then gain a new high that it had never seen before. Before we get to the high, though, we have to go through the low. So in 1942, Nebraska hired Glenn Presnell. He was an assistant under Lawrence Biff Jones, and he was brought in 1942, and he was actually the first Nebraska player to come back as a head coach. He would only coach for 1 season, going 3-7 before joining the Navy for the war effort. In 1943, they would actually bring on the basketball coach, Adolf Lewandowski, to take over the football program for 2 seasons. He's another former Nebraska player who had come back, and he, again, didn't see very much success. He went back-to-back 2-6 seasons, although it's not entirely his fault. As I mentioned, the war was going on, so aside from the lack of able-bodied men due to the war, the players were either unfit for the draft, in which case they weren't really great on the football field, or they weren't old enough to be drafted yet, which again, they weren't mature enough to be on the football field either. So either way, this ragtag group of players was unable to establish any kind of success during this period. Also at the time, Adolf Lewandowski was juggling many different hats, many different roles at the time. Simultaneously, he was the basketball coach, as I mentioned. He was the head football coach. He was also the athletic director and the athletic department business manager, all at the same time. So he had so much stuff on his plate, and he didn't have a whole lot to work with to begin with. So his back-to-back 2-6 seasons are kind of just par for the course. I mean, we were lucky to have any kind of seasons during this time. A lot of schools around the country during World War II didn't get to play any kind of games. So in 1945, we would bring George Potsy Clark. He was actually the athletic director that was brought in 1945, and they were unable to find a football coach in that time. So he actually would have to fill in on the football team, and he would go 4-5 in 1945, and then he would actually have to come back. We'll talk about that in the next coach, but he would have to come back in 1948, and he would go 2-8 in that season as well. So now we get into 1946. With World War II officially ending, Nebraska would start to see a lot more of those talented guys coming back to the field. However, the records wouldn't really reflect that change for many more years to come. Bernie Masterson was hired in 1946, and he has many parallels with Scott Frost. He was raised in Nebraska. He was born in Iowa, but he was raised in Lincoln. He played football, baseball, basketball, running track for Lincoln. He played for Dana Bible at Nebraska, winning 3 conference championships while he was a student, and he played for 7 seasons in the NFL before coaching quarterbacks at Stanford. Ironically, during that 1941 Rose Bowl, in which Nebraska went there and had a good, tough game against Stanford but ended up losing, he was the quarterback's coach at Stanford during that time. He would return to Nebraska as the prodigal son after Nebraska's 5 straight losing seasons, and he was supposed to bring back the glory. He was supposed to return the program to its former, golden years, and this is why, he has a lot of parallels already, just from being raised in Nebraska, being kind of like a high school legend, playing for Nebraska when they have successful seasons, going and playing some pro ball, and then coming back. He's supposed to be able to be that guy that reinvigorates the program, and you just don't see it at the beginning. But because of this hope, he was given a 5-year contract right off the bat at $10,000 a year, which is roughly $144,000 a year. He installed the innovative T formation that the Bears had been using in the NFL, so he kind of brought that back from his time in the NFL. The only problem with that is that he expected the college players to be memorizing 300 plus plays as the NFL players were doing. So I think that was a little bit too much to put on a college player's plate, and they would only go on to win 5 games in his 2 seasons there. This, in turn, encountered a lot of vicious and bitter hatred from the alumni, the fans, and the media, and it was so bad that they actually went forth and bought out his contract. It was the first coach bought out with private money. We kind of see that all the time nowadays, but this was the first time, and it kind of hadn't been done before. So this is what forced the Potsy Clark to return in 1948 as the head coach. Masterson would actually move out of the state after he was fired and die in 1963 at the age of 51. And many of the people surrounding him, they said from the time he left Nebraska to the time he died, his heart was filled with pain and sadness for the way he was treated at Nebraska. That just goes to show you that, like, a lot of these guys do intend to do well, and the state just turned on him. The golden child got turned on, and I mean, he died a sad person because of it. A bright spot in all of this depressing story was that Tom Trainwreck Novak emerged as a Husker legend. His name Trainwreck was given to him because of his vicious hits as a linebacker. There are actually stories of him hitting guys so hard that they would quit college football and go join the band. If that doesn't build your confidence, like, I hit that guy so hard he now plays the tuba, like, that is hilarious. And that's just, I mean, that already should cement you in like a legendary status. But he's the only 4-time all-conference player at Nebraska. Even to this day, nobody else has gotten 4 consecutive conference honors, and he played center and linebacker at Nebraska from 1946 to 1949. This was during that era still of the 60-minute man. He played offense, he played defense, and he never really came off the field unless he absolutely had to. His game against the eventual national champions in 1947 were against Notre Dame. That game in particular is what kind of cemented his legendary status. So the newspapers, the media, all these players that were recounting this game were saying that Tom Novak was everywhere. He seemed to be on every single play. At one point, he had made 17 of 21 tackles for Nebraska. It reminded me a lot of the Fordham game when, I can't remember his name, Greenhagen had, like, it seemed like he was on every single play. It didn't, like, you just heard his name repeatedly. And that's what Tom Novak was doing in this Notre Dame game. He actually earned a standing ovation from the Notre Dame crowd despite losing the game. And despite going 11-26 overall in his career, his ability was undeniable. You couldn't say that he wasn't putting forth his best effort, and we should have won more games because of it. But he would also go on to win 2 championships with the baseball team at Nebraska, being a multi-sport athlete. He truly gave everything he had to the program, though, both in terms of the abuse he would go through and just not wanting to come off the field. It would really take a toll on his body. He turned down multiple pro offers because of this, and because of the abuse he had taken, he couldn't imagine continuing on into the professional leagues. His number 60 is only one of 2 that are permanently retired in Nebraska, and I mean, he just left a spot in Nebraska history. He still has his name in record books as far as total tackles go, interceptions as a linebacker, that type of thing. In 1949, we would go on to hire Bill Glasford. After his hire in 1949, he would roll out some very controversial ideas for the time. In order to start competing in recruiting, he would ask that the university start offering scholarships. So up until this point, Nebraska had not offered scholarships. And there was a lot of controversy across the nation, really, about players getting paid with scholarships, and if that counted as, payment. And if so, that meant that they were, available to get workers' compensation. So the term student athlete came out during this time as like a workaround of that. They are not getting paid necessarily. They are getting, kind of reimbursed as a student for playing on the football team or on the baseball team. And so that was kind of his way to, install that at Nebraska. He also actually started to look outside the state for recruits. So up until this time, most fans, most players, most alumni didn't think that Nebraska players should come from outside Nebraska. As I mentioned during Biff Jones, he had 39 of 40 of his players were from Nebraska. And there was a lot of like, don't go out of the state, get everybody in the state. But he was like, I also need to go out of the state to get talent that we don't have here. So he met very little resistance in those two changes. After 8 straight losing seasons, Nebraska was kind of desperate for anything to change. In his second season in 1950, that would be the first winning season we would have in a decade. So from 1940 to 1949, we didn't win a single season. And then in 1950, we barely squeaked one out. So that was running behind Grand Island native sophomore Bobby Mr. Touchdown Reynolds. And that season alone, he ran for over 1,300 yards and 22 touchdowns. He never was able to really repeat that his junior or senior year because of injuries. But, I mean, that's like a legendary season in itself. I keep using that word because I feel like this time in history, you have legendary like spots throughout it, and you have to really acknowledge them. 1950 was also the first season in which Nebraska would have its spring game. We kind of now see that like that's a traditional thing for Nebraska. The red and white game is like a thing that we look forward to every year. I'm looking forward to it this year, talking about spring camp going on right now. But this 1950 was the first year in which we had a spring game. 1951 would be the first game that we would play at night. We would play it against Miami and we would lose. 1953 game against Oregon would be the first nationally televised NCAA game, and we would also lose that one as well. It was a very up and down record with Glasford. Glasford was also known as being very hard-nosed and brutal. He struggled to hold on to guys after guys returned from the Korean War. There was a lot of like individuality coming back from them. Like they would go through the war and they would come back and be like, I'm not going to put up with your crap. And he absolutely hated it. He didn't like that guys would like, you know, why should we do this? I mean, it wasn't like a retort type of thing. It was just, they kind of questioned his authority, and he absolutely hated it. He had Camp Curtis Horror Stories. This is a place that he would send them during spring conditioning, and it was like almost a literal farm. There was stories that they would have to climb a rope just to get to the locker room, get to the feed hall. So after these long days of practice, they would have to climb a rope just to get to a place to rest. There was very little water. There was a lot of pain. It was sweltering heat. And guys would go through that for 2 weeks of spring conditioning. It was actually eventually closed down because of player concerns for like their safety. But at this time, there was no time constraints on practice. So guys would practice anywhere from 10 to 14 hours a day. There was a guy in a documentary, he was talking about they would wake up at 5, they would practice for a couple hours, then they would eat breakfast, and then they would practice for a couple hours, and they would eat lunch, and then they would practice for a few more hours, and then they would eat supper, and then practice for like 3 hours before bed, and then they would get up the next day and do it all over again. So despite this, you know, this massive amount of like abuse that he would be putting on the players during this time, they were still losing a majority of the game. So it wasn't even paying off on the field. And this became so abrasive that the team petitioned before the 1954 season, demanding his resignation. 35 players got together with former alumni and demanded that he resign at the end of the 1954 season, or before the 1954 season. The university retained him anyway as his buyout was too large, but according to his players and according to kind of himself and the guys around him, he was surprised by the petition in the first place, and he was hurt by it as a result. He didn't realize that in his eyes, he was just, that was tough love. He was pushing these guys to physically get better. He didn't really see the line between pushing them hard and then the like abuse line. He didn't see the difference there. But as a result of getting petitioned and kind of that wake up call for him, he would improve his player relations in the next season. So in 1954, the team would go to its second bowl game, the Orange Bowl, in which it would lose to Duke. But then in the 1955 season, he would coach it again, not really having great success. But at the end of the season in 1955, he had an option to, it was kind of up to him if he wanted to come back for another 5 years or walk away. And he chose to walk away, and he resigned. And so in 1956, Nebraska would hire Pete Elliott. So Elliott was an Oklahoma assistant coach at the time, and we weren't able to beat them at all during Glasford's reign. And so we figured if we can't beat them, we might as well pull. It's very much like the Nick Saban theory. So a lot of people pull Nick Saban's assistant coaches hoping that they can get some like rub off from Nick Saban's magic dust that he uses. And so we hired an Oklahoma assistant coach thinking the same thing. He was brought on at only 29 years old, and Pete Elliott didn't really have the experience. He didn't really have knowledge of what to be doing at this time. And so he would go 4-6 in his sole season at the helm, and he wouldn't be retained. And that led to another 29-year-old, Bill Jennings, getting hired. He was a former assistant. He kind of came in with Pete Elliott. He was actually Elliott's assistant at Oklahoma as well. He followed him to Nebraska and then ended up getting that head coaching job after Elliott wasn't retained. He would bring Nebraska 5 straight losing seasons. I've heard Bill Jennings' name kind of tossed around a lot in regards to like comparing him to Scott Frost and just the success he has. In his 5 years with the 5 losing seasons, his record would be 15-34. So yes, there's a lot of like numerical comparisons, but I don't think that as of right now we can compare them, one for one. Although he couldn't get the consistent wins, he was able to pull out occasional upsets, which I think is a big reason that he was even retained for 5 years. At 15-34, you don't typically, at Nebraska during this time, you keep seeing guys leave after 1 or 2 seasons because they're not able to get the job done. And I think he was able to hold on to his job long enough because he kept beating a big opponent here and then a big opponent here, but he wasn't able to string them together in a successful season. This included an upset over Oklahoma on Halloween in 1959. This ended Oklahoma's 74-game conference winning streak, and that alone is pretty impressive, but he snapped it. He snapped it convincingly, and then Nebraska would go on to go 4-6 that year. So again, they would beat a big team. Oklahoma was ranked number 2 at that time, and then they would just like completely crap the bed the rest of the season. With the addition of Oklahoma State, the Big 8 would form while Jennings was in place, so that's kind of a historical thing. And as a result of his like failures repeatedly, he would clash personally with the fan base, with the expectations and the pressure coming from them and the media. And after he would leave, he had the quote that kind of floats around all the time that there's an intense desire to do something good in the state, like elect a president or gain prominence in politics, but we cannot feed the ego of the state of Nebraska with a football team. And I mean, many people kind of echoed the sentiment, but as we will see with the next coach, that wasn't completely true. So most of you guys know where this is headed next. We keep talking about this legendary coach that gets hired in the 60s. And so if you know anything about Husker football, you know like the big name that kind of everybody references. But what do you guys think about this period up to this point in Husker football? This was a down and out history that's kind of surprised me. I didn't know about it. And recent Husker history might make you feel kind of the same way, but we have had some pretty bad seasons lined up here, but averaging 3 wins over a 20-year period we haven't seen anything like that in my lifetime. So let me know below what you guys think up to this point. But now let's get into a guy that would ensure Nebraska would not have another losing season for the next 42 seasons. In 1962, Nebraska would try to hire away Michigan State coach Duffy Doherty. The unappealing thought of a rebuild in Nebraska, though, turned him off completely, so he said no thanks, but he did recommend his former assistant coach, who was currently coaching the Wyoming Cowboys, in Bob Devaney. He would emerge from Nebraska's worst 20-year stretch as a program and would give the state its best decade up to this point and cement Nebraska as a legacy program. However, he didn't initially want the job. Once he interviewed for the job and took a look at the facilities, kind of looked at how the last few coaches had been treated, he questioned the state's support. The facilities weren't good. In fact, he would say they were terrible, and he just wasn't completely convinced that he wanted to come to Nebraska. He had a few guys in his ear, though, that were talking, if you can win at Nebraska, if you can turn it around, you can win the conference, you can even potentially get up to that national title conversation. You can't really do that at Wyoming. So he was convinced to take the job, so he did leave Wyoming after 5 years, posting a record of 35-10-5 there. He got hired at a salary of $17,000, which is roughly $158,000 in today's money, and players would immediately call back to his ability to listen, his charisma, his confidence, and his belief in himself. His ability to listen was night and day difference from what Bill Glasford had kind of instilled in the program before. Bill Glasford kind of is his way or the highway. If you didn't like it, you could leave. And Bob Devaney was completely different. He took what you had to say to heart, and he actually made changes as much as he could, in best regards for the team. So Another noted thing was that there was an open competition for everybody as soon as he came in. There was, if there was guys that were established starters up to that point, didn't matter. Everybody was an open competition, and so that made kind of everybody that had already been kind of safe in their positions. They all had to compete for that job again, which reinvigorated this belief of competition. And so he immediately reinvigorated the program and established a belief in the program, not just in the team, but in the individual players themselves. Above all else, he said that self-belief was the utmost important for him and for his players. You could be the fastest, the strongest, the smartest, but if you don't believe in yourself, it doesn't really matter. Apparently, this mental shift was all it took for these players to take off, because he started winning games immediately in his first seasons with Bill Jennings players. In 1962, his first season, he would lead Nebraska to its first bowl game win over Miami, and this was in front of only around 1,000 fans in Yankee Stadium. There was a player of his that was talking in an interview, and he said that he stopped us before we went out into the field and said, "Guys, I'm sorry I got you into this mess, but this reminds me of, getting in fights in a back alley where I grew up, and it didn't matter if people were going to watch or whether they weren't going to watch, but you either were going to win or you were going to get your butt kicked." And so they went out there in a stadium. It was raining. It was kind of nasty weather, but they went out there and they beat Miami. And that 9 wins that season was the most since 1903. In 1963, his second season, the civil rights movement had kind of been heating up at this time, but the African-American players on the team would actually say that they didn't. I mean, they knew about the things going on in the nation. They knew about the riots, and they knew about the, the stand-ins and things like that. But it wasn't like they weren't feeling it on the football team, because Bob Devaney was colorblind, according to the players. He was, he was an open book. He listened to everybody. It didn't matter what color you were a football player to him, and he wanted you to do your best. So that was something, all around, there was not a single bad thing that anybody has ever said that I could find on Bob Devaney. They were set to play Oklahoma for the Big 8 championship in 1963, and JFK was assassinated the day before. The literal day before they were supposed to play for their first championship game in however long, the president was assassinated. And so Bobby Kennedy got called and kind of asked, do we even continue with this? The whole nation kind of stopped and didn't know what to do. So Bobby Kennedy, the brother, had gotten called and asked what he thought about the games and things like that, and he urged them to continue with the game. He said that that's what John would have wanted, so they continued with the game, and Nebraska would go on to win its first conference title since 1940. They would beat Auburn in the Orange Bowl later on that season. And an interesting side note in this 1963 season was that Frank Solich was brought in Devaney's first recruiting class, and so he would play in these games. And actually, Frank Solich's last game would be between Bob Devaney and Bear Bryant, and we'll kind of get into that later. But he said that's one of the most awesome things to go out of your college career, playing between 2 legendary coaches like that. Also around this time, the media started to make a huge impact on football as games were getting more televised, and the popularity kind of exploded because people didn't have to go to the stadium anymore. You could still have 80,000 fans in the stadium, but you could have 250 to 1 million fans watching at home, and so money started to roll in from this as well. And Bob Devaney really recognized the potential for this, and so he kind of became an evangelist of sorts for the state and for the program as well. So, as I mentioned, it was almost the state first. It was the program. He was trying to raise money for the program, obviously, to upgrade the facilities, to upgrade the stadium and things like that. But also, he was rooting for the state of Nebraska as a whole. Even though he's not from here, he's from Michigan, he rooted for the state his whole time he was here. And he formed great relationships with the boosters to fund improvements, as I mentioned, the stadium expansions and the improvements to the facilities. And he's a big reason that the sold-out streak begins with him. As I mentioned, he was charismatic. Any interview he had, he was making people laugh. He just had a very likable personality, and that went a long way for him. Now, he started to run into Bear Bryant in Alabama's legendary streak that they had under him, and after 2 straight bowl losses to him, they had established a personal rivalry at this time. He has a lot of interviews you can go watch on YouTube, and it's almost kind of funny. He was like, I would get a phone call from Bryant, and he would say, "Hey, we had a good game last year," and I would just get so mad because he stomped us. And he would say, "We had a good game last year. The Orange Bowl is looking good this year. What do you think? You got a good team. I got a good team." And that usually meant that he was gearing up to kick his butt. So this included an Orange Bowl with the national implications on the line in 1966, and they would get beat again by Alabama. This would kind of push Devaney into a period where he slipped, and they went 6-4 in back-to-back seasons in 67 and 68. And actually, at this point, fans started to say, he's not going to get this big, even though he was winning games and he was, in the conference talks every year. He wasn't winning the national championship at this point, which hadn't been done at Nebraska, and so pressure was mounting from the fans already. And this seems to be a recurring theme that Nebraska fans want more all the time, and whatever. But he went back to the drawing board. So to his credit, he never got too stubborn, and he never got too stuck in his ways to not pivot and to not make some changes that would allow his team to succeed. And those changes included promoting Tom Osborne to offensive coordinator. Up to this point, Tom Osborne was just an unpaid assistant to Bob Devaney, and he had no prior coaching experience before he came under Devaney. And I thought that was pretty interesting that he promotes this almost no-name guy to offensive coordinator and gives him full play calling, abilities. Bob Devaney preferred to run the ball. He was a very power run oriented guy. And Tom Osborne, despite later on in his career, which we'll get into in the next video, Tom Osborne was more balanced under his time with Devaney. He utilized the pass more. It was more of a balanced thing out of the I formation, and so that really took off in his time there. They also prioritized nutrition, strength, and conditioning to be able to close the gap with Alabama's speed. Every time they would play Alabama, that was the thing that the players noticed, and that was the thing that the coach noticed, was that it didn't matter how good the schemes were, how powerful they were. Alabama was just so fast as a team and as a unit. Nebraska couldn't keep up with them, and nobody could at the time. So they would prioritize strength and conditioning and nutrition to close that gap with them. And so then they would begin the 1969 season 2-2, and Nebraska would not lose another game until 1972. So they became national champions in 1970 after Texas and Ohio State both lost their bowl games, and they would repeat this in 1971, becoming the only modern team to beat the second, third, and fourth ranked teams by the end of the season. So I believe that was Texas, Oklahoma, and Colorado. They beat the AP second, third, and fourth ranked teams, and they're the only teams to have done that. And that included beating number 2 Ohio State 35-31 on Thanksgiving Day. Every other team that they beat that season was by at least 24 points. That included crushing Alabama finally 38-6 in the Orange Bowl. I believe that Devaney absolutely loved finally getting his revenge on Alabama, and he had actually planned to retire after the 1972 season, but after winning another national championship and looking like they could do it again the next season, it convinced him to stay for that unprecedented third consecutive title. And so in 1973, they would come back, and Johnny Rodgers would become the first Heisman for Nebraska that year. They would also go on to win the Orange Bowl for the third straight year over Notre Dame. Unfortunately, Nebraska dropped 2 regular season games that year, spoiling their chances for that third consecutive title, and he would retire after this season, shifting over to athletic director, a position which he would hold until 1993. When Bob Devaney arrived in Nebraska in 1962, the program had all but slid into obscurity. A once proud program had lost much of its former glory and was quickly losing the support of his fan base. But Bob Devaney would reinvigorate the program and would help to bring up not only the football program, but the university and the state as well. During his 11-year tenure, Devaney would produce 8 Big 8 championships, 2 national titles, 18 All-Americans, and go a record 136, 30, and 7. This included legendary players Johnny the Jet Rodgers, who would win the Heisman, and Larry Jacobson and Rich Glover, both of which would win the Outland trophies. He is arguably the most influential coach that the university has ever had, and although his time as a head coach alone should earn him that legendary status, it would be his decision to handpick his successor, an inexperienced, quiet coach that would lead to Nebraska being cemented as a titan of college football. Starting with Bob Devaney, Nebraska would go on a streak of 41 consecutive winning seasons, but we will get into that in part 3. If you enjoyed this Husker History video, be sure to subscribe and like it so you don't miss part 3, and let me know below, did you realize that that Bob Devaney had the impact he did on the program and on the state. Personally, I never knew about the 20 years of agony that the program went through before he came into the picture. And I had heard his name before. I kind of knew he was a legendary coach, but I didn't know any of the details. And I didn't realize that he had an impact past the football field. He really did bring the state of Nebraska forward as far as being in like a national presence. And I mean, I hope you guys learned something as well. Anyways, if you want to find me on social media, you can do so at Cobsmacked Media. But until the next video, go Big Red.